Hello everyone. In this episode we're going to examine Growth Diagnostics, a specific framework put together by Roderick, Hausman, and Velasco, and which has become very widely used as a tool of analysis, in addition to a conceptual framework as well. And so here the idea is that you focus specifically on the country's most binding constraint for investment as a determinant of subsequent economic growth. Underlying it is a framework of mathematical programming. The idea of focusing on the most binding constraint is one approach within that, but which has wide support for these applications. It's an example of a way of building on this notion that you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to development policy. This is one of the lessons learned in the 1980s response to the international debt crises in Latin America and even more so in sub-Saharan Africa. So the notion, though, is that it takes very careful research to determine what is the most likely binding constraint, or with uncertainty, what are perhaps the couple of most likely binding constraints. In doing so, Hausman, Roderick, and Velasco suggest a decision tree approach. They begin in their analysis with a statement of the problem, that it is caused by low levels of private investment and relatedly low levels of entrepreneurship. These factors are, of course, very significant in models of economic growth. That is to say, investment, as we've seen even in the long run in the AK or Haradomar model, and certainly in the medium run in the Solo framework, is a key determinant of the rate of economic growth, as well as determining, of course, the ultimate level of economic growth. Not the only factor, but an important one. So why might entrepreneurship and private investment rates be low? In this decision tree analysis, these analysts have put these into two main tree branches. One is a low return that investors get for one reason or another to economic activity, and the other is the high cost of financing that activity. Just very briefly, one of the sources of high cost of finance could be bad international finance. Access to international finance, loans, investment, and so on, that are below what can be expected for a country's prospects for development, and otherwise potential capacity to repay. It could be a reputational problem, or perhaps some institutional problem might need to be fixed also. Another possibility is bad local finance, of which there's two components: low domestic savings or poor intermediation. Now these we can even think of in terms of the growth models we have already looked at, however simple they may be. For example, with respect to low domestic savings, in the AK or Haradomar growth model, you'll recall that growth was proportional to net savings. It was inversely proportional to the I-core. And the I-core was an indicator in part of how efficiently that savings and then investment were used, translated into, if you want, subsequent economic growth. It's a measure of efficiency. And intermediation, the framework by which savings are brought into a financial system in which it can be reallocated to those with the most promising opportunities for successful investment. This is essential, and with poor intermediation, it's a problem. Now, these are the three final boxes with respect to finance. There are 10 final boxes overall. By final boxes, I mean boxes from which no further arrows emanate. And these are considered in this analysis the fundamental constraint groups, if you want, sets of constraint areas where we might look that are key to this analysis. And so there's three on the high cost of finance side: the poor intermediation, the low domestic savings, and the bad international finance. Turning now, with respect to possible causes, going through low return to economic activity. From here, there are two branches. One goes to underlying low social returns, productivity of the investment. And so these are divided into poor geography, bad infrastructure, and low human capital. Poor geography may have to do with, for example, mountainous areas. So some adjustment must be made for the exogenous terrain that has not been successfully carried out before. Another is low human capital, so that the constraint could be, for example, too little education is getting done. There's a high return on education, but too few, for example, high school graduates are found and available. And then there's bad infrastructure, which could refer to roads from economic activity areas to markets, port facilities for exports, and some other possibilities. These are 3 of the 10 final boxes, if you want. So now we have covered 6. We've got 4 more to go. The other side is low appropriability. The underlying returns to the activity would be high. The problem in this case is that the entrepreneurs and other investors have low appropriability for their work from the proceeds of their activities or potential activities. And that's important as well. And this can spring from 2 kinds of basic failures. One is government failures and the other is market failures. Among government failures, this indeed is what we have been studying in this chapter 4 of the textbook. This analysis divides the market failures in 2 parts, micro risks and macro risks. Among micro risks, they tend to place many of the institutional problems and the way that they have impacted the economy that we've been looking at. A key example is property rights. Insufficient property rights can prevent individuals and firms from investing. They lack the confidence that their investments won't be expropriated. Losses due to corruption on the part of government and taxes. This, of course, does not mean any taxes, but confiscatory taxes, as we might call them. Taxes that are beyond what is reasonable costs of government and reasonable to provide incentives for profit-making investments. On the macro risk sides, we haven't covered these yet in much detail. They are covered later in the text in chapters 13 and 14, but these are financial, monetary, and fiscal instability, macro problems. Market failures, here the focus is not particularly on the important but very localized market failures that have impacts to local economic activity. I think here about local pollution. A serious problem can add up for problems for the economy. Perhaps should be added here, but note that the idea of these authors is to think about economy-wide market failures that can lead to extensive failure for the economy, perhaps even to get economic development underway, or to reach some stage at which growth greatly slows down, even though there are many other opportunities available for technology transfer, or simply plateaus at a kind of middle income trap. And the 2 kinds that are identified by these authors for special attention are first, information externalities. Information problems is key in many ways for problems in economic development. Here they underline the self-discovery problem, the problem of the country determining the activities in which it has comparative advantage. The other is coordination externalities. This refers to the kind of coordination failures that we've looked at in some detail in chapter 4. This includes the big push, certainly, but also some special cases of complementarities that can lead to too little investment in skills. We looked at that formally with respect to the O-ring model of economic development. So this is the framework. This is the way of thinking through what kind of constraint that the country faces. Here it's abstract. We'll make it a little bit more specific in the case of an application to Bangladesh shortly. So these, again, as I suggested, the constraint categories to look at are the boxes from which no further arrows emanate, and there's 10 altogether, as we've just seen. They're really quite comprehensive. I want to give an example. I sometimes ask groups to name additional constraint boxes that they think could have been left out. Sometimes there's a pretty straightforward answer to these, I think. One of the most common suggestions is that natural disasters are a key constraint that affect many economies and can be a reason why they're set back. And of course that is true. Undoubtedly, they pose immediate constraints, and we can think as an example of the great earthquake that hit Haiti. However, I think that many analysts would argue that if there are extended problems for growth that follow such a disaster, whether it be a cyclone, hurricane, or earthquake, and so on, that government failure is likely to be the root problem, not the initial disaster. Because some countries, including developing countries, in some cases low-income developing countries, have shown remarkable resilience in snapping back from severe environmental catastrophes like major hurricanes, earthquakes, and so on, and others have not. So attention starts to be focused on the quality of institutions that would either enable or make it very, very difficult, if not impossible, for a government to have an adequate response so that growth can resume. Some other independent boxes have been raised for consideration. They're debatable, but you can think about them. One is environment. This could be a combination of domestic environmental degradation or large-scale exogenous climate change impacts. The latter, unfortunately, analysts expect to grow in their scope and scale, hitting, in an ecological sense, most severely sub-Saharan Africa in the world, and perhaps in second place, likely in second place, South Asia. Indeed, also domestic environmental degradation, while often localized, can, when taken together and without a response, lead to significant damage also to the economy and even the incentive to invest. In terms of the agricultural sector, that can include soil salination, that can include desertification, it can include substantially falling water tables as irrigation pumps out fossil waters that cannot be easily replaced. And taken as a whole, that might constitute a constraint that's worth thinking about indeed. Inability to resolve conflict, whether violent conflict or not. This might be a separate box. It reasonably can be understood as a failure of institutions, but maybe it involves a special case. Now, whether that means another box or a special category among the micro failures and so on, that is a matter for debate and interpretation. Another is social capital, sometimes called cultural, but social capital, these dimensions specifically include a lack of trust, a pervasive lack of trust, which can be a kind of result of a multiple equilibria situation, in which in one equilibrium there's a high level of trust, and in another a low level. And so a low level of forming businesses can be seen in places where there are norms such as saying, you should never trust anyone who is not a member of your family. Caution is advised and so on, but you can see that this lack of trust could prevent the creation of many potential business partnerships that could indeed prove highly productive. So identifying other possible missing boxes is a good discussion exercise. So let's take a look at what this is about in practice. Really careful research is needed to determine the most likely binding constraint. Many people have a quick reaction when they think about many countries as a group, such as developing countries or a specific group. And you can think of that as an example, perhaps, of thinking fast in Kahneman's framework of System 1 and System 2. as we'll study behavioral economics' role in development economics a little bit at least before long. And a reaction is, well, corruption is the problem everywhere, and it can be the binding constraint in some places, and it is a problem in many, many places. The question in this analysis, though, is what could we address specifically first that would have the impact, the immediate impact, on getting growth either resumed or raised to an attainable level. So to evaluate whether any proposed constraint is binding or not, one looks for evidence of its implications. You won't find out there, a sign somewhere saying this is the binding constraint. You don't see it directly. It's a concept. So you have to consider predictions. If that's the binding constraint, what would be out there? Then you have to look for that evidence. So examples, if the constraint were to be excessive taxation, you can expect a high movement of entrepreneurs, potential entrepreneurs, into the informal sector or so-called underground economy where taxes can be evaded. It has costs to operate in this sector. You may not have legal protections and so on. So really that it depends on the benefits as well, which could be tax evasion if taxes are sufficiently high or too high. If the constraint is infrastructure, you can expect a lot of congestion. It's difficult to make the case that the roads are the constraint if the roads are not highly congested. That's kind of an obvious example, but nonetheless. If the constraint is education, you can expect high rates of return to education. It's difficult to make the case that the binding constraint for our country is a failure of getting kids into high school if the extra wages that students earn having gone to high school is not very much higher than the wages earned by those who have not gone to school. It doesn't mean high school is a bad idea. Almost certainly it's a good idea. It means it's not a binding constraint on growth right now. Might it become one in the future? Of course. And could that mean it needs attention now because of lags in the system? Yes, of course. But it's a really important clue about what is the immediate focus of attention right now for encouraging more investment. Then in generalized, the analyst wants to look for economic behavior that's consistent with agents trying to get around a constraint. So this is an additional point area that applies to several of these, more obviously for some than for the others, but for example, moving into the informal economy is one example of trying to get around a constraint. So we have these so-called principles of a differential diagnosis put together by Ricardo Hausmann and some of his colleagues. And so in this, if a constraint is binding, you should see four things. The first is the shadow price of the constraint should be high. In other words, the underlying value of the input, for example, is much higher perhaps than what appears from the market price or the exchange price. Movements in the constraint should produce significant movements in the objective function. So if the objective function in this case is to encourage higher investment and hence higher growth, you should see that as a result, for example, of expanding high school education in a low-income country. Agents in the economy should be attempting to overcome or bypass the constraint, and so that shifting to other means of transportation could be one example. Agents less intensive in that constraint should be more likely to survive and thrive, and vice versa. A couple examples that come to mind. One is that in problems of institutions in which you have authoritarian regimes with cronyism, in these cases you should find that industries that are associated with business people who are closely tied in with the government are those that are likely to thrive. And sectors of the economy where those connections are weak, you would expect not to. in a way that would be differential from what you see in similarly situated countries otherwise. Another example that could point at finance problems. There are a variety of sectors of activity in the economy, such as textile producing, chemicals, and so on. Some of them, in studies that you can see from around the world, tend to finance themselves through retained earnings. Others tend to be externally financed by debt, equity, and so on. And so that if finance is a problem, you should expect to find sectors that internationally tend to rely more than in other cases on internal finance. And it turns out that textiles is one of those. So I hope this gives you a few illustrations of this. So then we're going to go to our particular case. It's also described in the textbook with a source. This method was broadly used to find out the binding constraints of growth for the case of Bangladesh. It was carried out by a combined team of the USAID and the UK aid in conjunction with Bangladesh. One of the goals here, which I think is of some interest, especially as we go into examining inclusive development more thoroughly when we get next to chapter 5, is that one thing they tried to do was to look at inclusive growth in the context of opportunities for women. So not just think of constraints on investment and hence on growth, but think about constraints on investment that would have the differential effect, perhaps, of lowering opportunities for women or keeping opportunities for women from rising to the same degree as it may have been doing for men. And so they proceeded, and they were able initially to rule out some of the constraint boxes, if you want to say that. So for the case of finance that we just addressed, their assessment said, well, we just cannot make a strong case that this is what's binding right now. But they recommended that it would need attention going forward. So there's a lot of different conclusions that you can draw once you get into doing this in practice. It's maybe not always as simple as the basic model might suggest. Regarding market failure, and here they looked at coordination and information externalities in particular, they found that market failures were indeed important concerns, but right now, given severity of other problems, they were unlikely to be the currently binding constraint, and that may be possible. With respect to human capital, it might have been a guess that this is a place to look because we have frequently thought about Bangladesh when we think about education because of their remarkable and to some degree unpredicted, unexpected success. They did notice and make a point of highlighting the progress in the field and especially for girls' education. This certainly was a subject that came up in the comparison of the cases of Bangladesh and Pakistan in the end of chapter 1 case study. However, at this point in time, the returns for education in general are not particularly high. And indeed, firms did not cite education levels as a problem. In terms of how to search for evidence, I should certainly suggest that this is a major way to get this information. Ask people, never be afraid to ask people, and in particular, systematic and, if at all possible, large-scale survey analysis of firms' responses to questions like, what are your problems, what's holding you back, and so on, can be very useful, and usually is useful when such is available. There are some other kinds of data that you can focus on and use. An example are global benchmarking indices. I'll come back to that in a moment. So education is not it's not what's explaining international migration patterns, for example, who is going to work in the Middle East and so on. No clear relationship between labor intensity and growth by industry. which is related to education. And so they said, again, education's not now binding, but they did point out that despite that, there was evidence that education remains of low quality, and in particular, it has a very high variance. There's some schools, including elementary schools and high schools, that you can go to that are of very high quality, unfortunately many that are at fairly low levels of quality. And so they thought that it would make it a potential constraint going forward and should have some attention now. What about government failure? Well, they didn't really find evidence for problems in contract enforcement. That's an example, as we've seen before, back in chapter 2, of an institutions problem. With respect to corruption, the authors decided to term it a most binding constraint. That's an unusual construction of phrasing. It is not so consistent with the underlying rigorous model behind this, but nonetheless, in terms of what one has to do in the field with the data that you have, you can understand how this might be raised. More specifically, perhaps, they later also said that in some sectors, that is to say, in this case, using this sector with the meaning of activity or industry areas, it's close to binding, that corruption is impinging on that activity to the point where it could be what's holding back activities in that part of the economy, but not likely binding on growth. So that corruption can be a problem, but not the current present problem that the country perhaps most needs to address if its goal is to get economic growth going and accelerated. And so I mentioned that firm surveys were one major source that's often used in order to answer these questions. And in Bangladesh, the firm surveys that were done, did not find that firms were addressing corruption as what was holding them back, which is already kind of striking because, well, first of all, corruption anywhere it exists does need to be eradicated. And also because there is a kind of thinking fast idea of saying, what's your problem? Corruption. So it was striking that they did not. Also, another area where you can find data are the so-called benchmarking indices. And because we're talking about corruption, I'll give the example of Transparency International's international corruption indices. And Bangladesh doesn't come out great, but they don't come out worse than its comparator countries. So you can see more about that in the textbook. They're somewhere around the middle of the pack among countries that these analysts thought the country might be reasonably compared to. And so it's not that the amount of bribes paid is not substantial, but it was actually below Cambodia and Philippines by a long shot. And so that was part of why they said this clear relationship could just not be found between corruption and investment. What about infrastructure? Here things got a little bit more interesting. Not infrastructure in general, though in the past that has been serious problem in Bangladesh, including lack of bridges. But the authors, in examining different components of infrastructure, focused on electricity infrastructure. They decided it was indeed the most binding constraint. And so, first of all, regarding a high shadow price, the team reports that the cost of non-grid electricity is several times that of bulk electricity tariff rates. That is to say, if you look at the official cost of electricity, it doesn't sound so high, but in terms of what people actually are willing to pay when they cannot get it, you get a very different picture, several times higher. As far as movements of in the constraint, shifting the objective, they find that the availability of electricity in a certain area has been followed by higher electricity using investment. Causality is always a big problem for working out in a convincing way. they decided that it was likely causal. It was likely the fact that adding electricity availability caused subsequent electricity using investment. So regardless of that, they found that firms and also the government are using private generators, private diesel generators for not just to entirely replace the grid, but for when there are frequent blackouts, as there are in many developing countries, including Bangladesh. Sometimes they're even planned, rolling blackouts. So, but they found that these firms were in fact using these generators, and so they decided, this really is an example of trying to get around the constraint. The constraint is there is either no electricity available or it's too unreliable. And so the evidence was not so clear about whether less intensive users of electricity were thriving. And so, I like it most when presenters of studies like this, rather than try to find a story and then push the story, are also willing to say, well, the story's not quite enough here, we don't have the evidence, it's not so clear. And so one has to look at the preponderance, the strong preponderance of the evidence. The team also proposed that greater electricity capacity and reliability could lead to more formal sector employment, including in the ready-made garments sector. So overall, to conclude, the authors find the constraint is that firms don't have enough electricity access and reliable access, and so that electricity capacity investment would have the largest impact on growth. They also found that it would have special and notable impacts on employment and incomes for women, who are those who are more likely than in other sectors to work in such activities in the economy, often having to do with ready-made garments and similar kinds of economic activities to which millions of women have moved from what were previously very low paid activities and occupations in rural areas, often under bad conditions. So this is how growth diagnostics was done in one interesting case. Interesting in part because they're trying to work out also how can you go beyond thinking of this as a problem of raising general growth and investment to at least starting to think about how you can take into account investments and constraints on investments that could lead to more inclusive outcomes. So we'll leave it here.